A woman's scream, the sound of an infant gasping for its first breath. Then silence. The camera lingers on a narrow hallway, brick walls glistening with dampness. Somewhere below, in a basement not marked on any architectural plans, a wooden door groans shut. Behind it lies a maternity ward that no hospital ever listed, no census ever recorded, and no church ever blessed. In the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, families whispered of a place where children were not born of love, nor even of chance, but of design. A breeding ground hidden within the property of the Rothmann family estate, where daughters were daughters no longer, but vessels. The official records describe a long and noble line of industrialists, philanthropists, and church benefactors. But between 1923 and 1963, the Rothmann family carried a secret. It began with a disappearance. A farm girl, barely 16, vanished after a Sunday service, then another. Soon families spoke less. Mothers silenced their daughters. The local sheriff filed no reports. By the time anyone dared to search, the trail led to the Rothmann mansion. Its cellar locked, its windows blacked out. There are photographs that survive. Faded, sepia-toned images of rows of iron beds, white sheets tucked military tight, a single crucifix nailed above a concrete arch. No nurse uniforms, no medical insignia. Only young women, pale and thin, their eyes hollowed into shadows. What was birthed here was not simply life, but an experiment, one that required silence, obedience, and above all, secrecy. The cries of newborns echoed through stone corridors, yet none were ever seen in town. This is the story of a hidden maternity ward, and the family who dared to build a dynasty from it. The Rothmans were the kind of family no one dared accuse. They owned the textile mills, paid the church tithes in full, and donated to every war effort. Their name adorned the stained glass windows of the Presbyterian chapel, their portraits hung in the courthouse, and their money paid for the schoolhouse bell. But beneath that philanthropy lay dominion. Their workers lived in Rothmann, built housing, their debts tied to Rothmann banks, and their worship led by a Rothmann-funded pastor. When the sheriff was offered his badge, it was at a dinner table in their dining hall. When the judge needed campaign funds, the Rothmans provided. So when whispers spread of missing farm girls, they were drowned in polite nods and silences. She ran off with a man. She went west to find work. She couldn't handle the shame. Such explanations satisfied the surface, but never the conscience. Mothers prayed harder. Fathers locked their doors earlier. Inside the Rothmann estate, however, something else was unfolding. The family had converted their root cellars into chambers. Stone corridors ran beneath the main house, expanding into rooms large enough for rows of cots, iron cribs, and tiled floors fitted with drains. They called it the ward. Records that survived mention only caretakers and nurses, but no names. These women wore no official insignia, yet they were paid in envelopes of Rothmann cash. Their duty: keep the daughters docile, keep the births hidden, and keep the infants from being recorded in any parish or county book. The Rothmans' generosity had bought them silence. Respect became their weapon. While the town saw benefactors, the estate held something closer to a laboratory, and in that silence, the ward began to fill. The Rothmann mansion itself was designed to impress from above and to conceal below. Visitors marveled at its columns, marble staircases, and chandeliers imported from France. Yet its real genius lay underground. Local masons, sworn to secrecy, were paid handsomely to expand the basements. They carved out chambers with low ceilings, no windows, and thick iron doors. Each door had a sliding latch, allowing entry from outside but not within. Ventilation shafts were disguised as chimneys. One section was tiled like a hospital ward. Another resembled a nursery with rocking chairs and rows of bassinets, but none of it bore the insignia of any legitimate institution. Every passage curved, disorienting newcomers, so that escape was impossible without guidance. One hallway even looped back upon itself, ending in the same corridor. One began with a psychological trick to crush hope. Survivors, those rare few who lived long enough to speak, described the smell: carbolic soap, blood, and something sour like milk left to rot. The sound of dripping water echoed through stone arches. At night, the low hum of generators filled the dark. Above, the Rothmans entertained guests, hosted balls, and signed business contracts. Beneath their feet, young women labored, cried, and birthed children into secrecy. This was not improvisation. It was engineering. The estate itself was a machine for control. Its architecture designed not only to hide but to command. The earliest known records suggest the hidden ward began operating in 1923. That year, 3 local girls vanished. 2 from the mill, 1 from a farmstead near the Delaware River. None returned. Months later, townsfolk whispered that a wagon delivered supplies to the Rothmann estate at midnight: sheets, medicine, kerosene lamps. But no invoice was ever filed. The ward's first children were born into silence. No midwives announced their names, no bells rang to welcome them, no baptismal fonts touched their skin. Instead, their cries echoed against stone. Each child was taken from its mother within hours. The women were drugged with chloroform, left to wake to emptiness. Some girls were allowed to remain in the ward, bred again, their bodies reduced to function. Others disappeared entirely, as if their usefulness had expired. Rumors tell of shallow graves in the orchard, of pigs fed too well that summer. One photograph, recovered decades later, shows a row of bassinets against a bare wall. Each crib is labeled only with a Roman numeral I, Roman II, Roman III. No surnames, no identity, just sequence. The Rothmans told themselves they were preserving bloodlines, purity, order, but beneath those justifications lay something hungrier: control over life itself. The first births set the rhythm. By 1925, the ward had expanded. By 1927, it had become routine. The Rothmans' family legacy was no longer built on factories or land, but on the bodies they could command. Between 1923 and 1930, records show 2 young women vanished within a 50-mile radius of the Rothmann estate. No investigations, no trials, no newspaper headlines. Families learned to bury their questions. To ask was to invite shame, or worse, the town whispered excuses. She eloped, she ran away, she drowned. The Rothmann name was never spoken. But something odd began to emerge. The town's population remained steady, yet its children seemed unaccounted for. Families recalled hearing babies crying in the night, though no new mothers lived nearby. School rosters listed fewer births than the cries would suggest. Midwives confessed to neighbors that months would pass without a single delivery request, despite the town's young population. Meanwhile, the Rothmann estate grew wealthier. Contracts secured, land expanded, the family line never weakened, never dwindled. Each generation produced heirs in perfect succession. Healthy, intelligent, disciplined, never a stillbirth, never a scandal. The disappearances weren't seen as connected until much later, when county clerks compared missing persons files with hospital registries. Only then did the gaps form a shape, a pattern, a shadow moving through Pennsylvania, one name behind it all. But by then, decades had passed. The Rothmans had already secured their dynasty. What made the ward possible was not only wealth, but silence. Silence bought, silence sanctified. The Presbyterian pastor of the town was invited often to the Rothmann estate. He returned with gifts, imported books, new robes, fine wine. His sermons grew cautious. He spoke often of obedience, of daughters knowing their place, of God's will expressed through suffering. He never mentioned the missing. Some say he blessed the ward itself, sprinkling holy water across its tiled floors. Others claim he looked away, convincing himself the family's charitable efforts outweighed whatever strange practices lay below. Confessionals were filled with trembling mothers, half speaking their fears, yet no parish record contains a single note of those confessions, burned perhaps or locked away. The church received Rothmann donations that built a new spire, a new bell, and a new pipe organ. It is said that one of the ward's rooms contained pews, arranged like a chapel, where the girls were forced to kneel before they labored. A crucifix loomed above, its face worn blank by candle smoke. The message was unmistakable. Obedience was holy, silence was sacred, and their suffering was God's design. The church did not merely allow the ward, it sanctified it. The most chilling detail of the Rothmann ward was not only how the mothers were erased, but how the children were. Each infant was stripped of identity, no surnames, no lineage, no baptismal record. They were given numbers, initials, sometimes biblical titles: Samuel, Eve, Jacob, but never a full name. They belonged not to a mother, nor even to the Rothmann line, but to the program itself. Nurses kept meticulous ledgers, their handwriting uniform and cold. Columns marked birth weight, sex, temperament, survivability. Notes reduced a newborn to a set of qualities: docile, strong lungs, prone to fits. Those deemed weak vanished quickly. Some claimed they were sent back to God. Others suggested they were used in experiments: starvation, exposure, chemical tonics. No graves were ever found. The strong children were raised in shadow. Some were given to Rothmann relatives, passed off as adopted cousins. Others were sent far away to affiliated farms, seminaries, or even orphanages tied to Rothmann donations. Their origins erased, they became hidden threads in the fabric of American society. But those who remained in the ward were raised like stock, trained to walk in unison, to recite prayers in silence, to eat and sleep on command. A family built not from love, but from selection. In 1932, a storm flooded the lower levels of the Rothmann estate. Servants whispered that several boxes of records were ruined, but one ledger survived, later discovered in an attic trunk by a distant cousin decades later. It was bound in black leather, initials R.F. embossed on the cover. Inside, the entries chilled even hardened archivists. Each page listed births by Roman numeral, followed by shorthand notes: I, male, strong chest, reserved; Roman II, female, withdrawn, compliant; Roman III, male, temperament, restless, remove. Nowhere did the words mother or father appear. Instead, bloodlines were drawn like equations. Arrows connected names, suggesting selective pairings, forced unions, and repeated cycles. The handwriting revealed an obsession with purity, with removing weakness. Perhaps most disturbing were the annotations in red ink: reuse viable stock. Dispose, promising. These were not the words of caretakers, they were the cold calculus of breeders. That ledger, if authentic, was never admitted into evidence. The Rothmann influence stretched too far. But those who touched its pages reported the same unease, as if the book itself carried the cries of children erased from history. No breeding program could exist without medical complicity, yet no official physician ever came forward. Still, anomalies emerge in the records. Local doctors billed the estate for supplies, but never logged patient names. Pharmacists filled prescriptions for morphine, ether, quinine, yet no hospitals reported their use. One rumor tells of Dr. Abram Weller, a physician who vanished after attending the estate in 1937. His horse was found wandering near the Delaware River, his satchel still inside the saddle. His disappearance was never explained. Some say he spoke too much. Others recall medical students visiting the estate for training. They were offered Rothmann scholarships in exchange for silence. Their careers flourished. None ever mentioned where their knowledge of obstetrics truly began. These were not healers, they were engineers of silence. Their instruments carved away more than flesh. They carved away memory, identity, and dignity. The ward thrived not because of secrecy alone, but because men with white coats chose to look away. Not every girl submitted quietly. Some tried to flee. A farm hand once claimed he found a barefoot girl running through the orchard at night, her dress torn, belly heavy with child. He tried to help, but within minutes, Rothmann men arrived with lanterns. They dragged her back screaming, her voice echoing through the trees. By dawn, the orchard was silent again. Others tried starvation, hoping to end their pregnancies, but the ward controlled every morsel. Some attempted self-harm with shards of glass or sharpened spoons, yet the nurses were vigilant. The program required live births, and every life was enforced with brutal efficiency. The most haunting account came from a servant who overheard a girl whispering through a floor grate, "If I can't leave, I'll make sure it dies with me." The next morning, that girl was gone, her bed stripped, her belongings burned. The ward did not tolerate rebellion. Escape attempts only deepened the Rothmann resolve to them. Suffering proved weakness, and weakness was to be eliminated. By the 1940s, some of the Rothmann-born children were old enough to question. They had been raised in silence, given numbers or biblical titles, trained to obey. Yet memory is stubborn. One survivor, decades later, recalled a nursery where the walls were painted gray, no windows, no toys, only rows of identical cribs. She described how the nurses moved like shadows, never speaking unless to command. She remembered lullabies sung without words, only humming, as if to erase language itself. Another child recalled a game, being forced to stand in a line, blindfolded, while a bell rang. If they moved before the bell, they were beaten. If they did not move after the bell, they were beaten still. Discipline was not about learning, it was about breaking. Some of these children were eventually placed into Rothmann, linked families, given new names, new lives. Yet flashes of memory lingered, stone walls, echoing cries, the smell of bleach. They grew into adults with nightmares they could never explain. The program's true horror was not only in the mothers it consumed, but in the children it produced. Lives engineered, memories fractured, identities erased. By 1943, the ward had operated for 2 decades. Its machinery of silence remained intact, but townsfolk were beginning to notice fractures. Women whispered of strange figures walking the orchard at night. Children too tall for their age, their eyes too blank. A seamstress claimed she delivered gowns for girls who were never seen again. A milkman told his wife he delivered twice the usual supply, though the estate housed only a dozen servants. Yet these whispers were never spoken loudly. To accuse the Rothmans was to risk ruin, land could be taken, jobs lost, families turned out of their homes. Still, some began to suspect. The old pastor, his hands shaking with guilt, confided to a colleague that there are cries under the earth. That colleague told no one. Not until years later, when the pastor was long dead, did the words surface. The town's silence was not ignorance, it was survival. The Rothman's shadow lay across every roof, every table, every prayer. To question them was to threaten the fragile fabric of community itself, but silence has a limit. World War Roman II gave the Rothmans both cover and opportunity. With the nation's attention overseas, disappearances stirred less notice. Men went off to fight. Families moved for factory work, record, keeping loosened in the chaos. Within the estate, the program expanded. Some suggest the Rothmans saw themselves as patriots, perfecting American stock while the world tore itself apart. Others whisper they were feeding something older, something hungrier than politics. Ledgers from 1944 mention an unusual spike in births, twice the usual number, yet more than half the infants were marked removed. Removed where? Removed how? The records never say. Meanwhile, the Rothman sons returned from the war decorated, their reputation spotless. They married, produced heirs, and carried the family line forward. No one questioned how every Rothman child was healthy, strong, and eerily similar in bearing. The war years did not weaken the program, they emboldened it. Death abroad made death at home easier to ignore. The first real crack came in 1947. A servant named Helen Markham, who had scrubbed floors in the estate for 7 years, fled the property and confessed to a visiting cousin. Her words spilled like poison. She spoke of underground rooms where girls screamed through childbirth, of infants taken in the night, never to be seen again, of ledgers kept under lock and key. Her cousin urged her to go to the sheriff. But Helen refused. He already knows, she whispered. They all know. Days later, Helen was found drowned in the river, her pockets weighted with stones. The death was ruled suicide. Her cousin never spoke again, leaving town within a month. Helen's name faded from memory, but her whispers lingered, a rumor here, a suggestion there, enough to spark doubt in a handful of minds, enough to make silence harder to keep. The Rothmans had killed one voice. But they could not kill the echo. In 1951, a boy appeared in a nearby town, thin, pale, barefoot. He claimed he had lived in the stone house, and that his mother cried all the time. When pressed, he said his name was Roman 12, the Roman numeral tattooed faintly on his wrist. No one believed him. He was dismissed as a runaway, a child telling wild tales. The sheriff returned him quietly to the Rothman estate. He was never seen again. Yet one teacher remembered his words. She wrote them in her diary. There are children underground. They are made, not born. That diary was found decades later, stained with age, but the words still legible. The boy's brief escape proved something vital. The ward was real. The program was not just whispers or rumor. A child had seen it, a child had lived it, and a child had tried to warn the world. By the early 1950s, cracks widened. Too many whispers, too many coincidences. A nurse who had served in the war compared the Rothmann ward to camps she had seen overseas. A midwife recalled being paid to dispose of sheets stained with more than blood. Yet when questions reached officials, records disappeared. Court files went missing, witnesses recanted, reporters abandoned their investigations after private conversations with Rothmann lawyers. Still, pressure grew. Families of the vanished demanded answers. A local journalist published an article in 1955 titled "The House Without Windows." It never mentioned the Rothmanns by name, but everyone knew. Within months, the journalist's home burned in a faulty wiring accident. His wife and child perished in the fire. His notes were never found. The Rothmanns had preserved their silence for 30 years. But now silence was beginning to consume them too. In 1957, a fire gutted part of the Rothmann estate. Officially, it was caused by lightning. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. Servants swore they saw men carrying crates of ledgers into the flames. Whole rooms of documents fed to the fire. Photographs, records, journals, gone. When the blaze was finally quenched, the basement walls were scorched black, and the hidden ward was sealed in rubble. The Rothmann family declared it a tragic loss of history. But for those who suspected the truth, it was clear the family was purging evidence. Still, fragments survived: a charred ledger page, a photograph hidden in a trunk, a diary line written in haste. These scraps are all we have to prove the ward existed. The rest was consumed in smoke, as if the program itself sought to erase its own memory. By 1963, the program was finished. The last known births took place in 1962. Then the ward was sealed, the estate remodeled, and the Rothmann heirs moved to Philadelphia. But the children of the ward did not vanish. They lived on. Some became scholars, politicians, businessmen, hidden threads woven into America's fabric. Others lived quietly, haunted by memories of stone walls and numbered cribs. What united them was silence. Few spoke of their origins. Those who tried were dismissed as unstable, their stories too monstrous to believe. Yet the uncanny similarities among Rothmann descendants, all symmetrical, eerily alike, raised questions even in polite company. The program had ended, but its fruits still walked among us. In the 1970s, researchers began collecting oral histories from townsfolk. Elderly women confessed what they had long suppressed: the cries in the night, the disappearances, the sense of something unholy beneath the Rothmann name. One former servant described a room of white sheets, soaked red by dawn. Another recalled lullabies hummed by nurses, tuneless, mechanical, designed to soothe without meaning. Survivors of the ward itself rarely spoke, but when they did, their testimonies converged. The smell of bleach, the iron doors, the way numbers replaced names. Yet every attempt to publish these accounts met resistance. Lawsuits, threats, sudden withdrawals of funding. The Rothmann name still carried power. The survivors' whispers remained fragmented, scattered, almost spectral, enough to suggest the truth, never enough to prove it. What then was the purpose? Why hide a maternity ward for 40 years? Why erase mothers, number children, and purge records? The answers are elusive. Some claim the Rothmanns sought purity of bloodline, engineering their descendants like livestock. Others whisper darker theories, that the children were not only heirs but offerings, sacrifices in flesh to an older covenant, one that demanded birth, pain, and silence. What remains undeniable is the pattern: girls taken, children erased, silence enforced. A dynasty built not only on industry, but on wombs enslaved in stone chambers. Even now, fragments surface: photographs of iron cribs, ledgers marked in code, family portraits where the children look too alike. Each fragment is a shard of a mirror no one dares assemble. The Rothmanns survived, the town survived, but beneath their survival lies a wound that has never healed. A wound carved by a hidden maternity ward that turned life itself into an experiment. The cries of those children are gone, but if you listen closely to the silence beneath Pennsylvania's soil, you might still hear them.